With the goal of going where the evidence best points by allowing falsifiability to run its course, I have decided to test the covenantal inclusion model of I/O objectively and fairly as a way to eliminate my own bias and assumptions. That means setting aside loyalty to any inherited formulations, whether bloodline-only, covenantal inclusion, or otherwise, and allowing the biblical texts, covenantal structures, and historical data to speak on their own terms. Testing the model, therefore, requires following the evidence even when it unsettles, comfortable boundaries, exposes inconsistencies in long-held positions, or demands refinement of the I/O framework itself, because a position that cannot withstand scrutiny from within is not strengthened by being protected from it. To be fair, I will also be testing the bloodline-only I/O model with the same tests, same standard, same data, and same burden of proof. These tests are not designed to favor one model over another, but to evaluate whether either model can define its claims, account for the data, and survive falsification. The definition test, the first way to test the covenantal inclusion model of I/O, is to ask whether Scripture explicitly defines covenant identity. The covenantal inclusion model of I/O grounds Israel's identity in covenantal mechanisms, such as oath, circumcision, law, and Passover, all of which are explicitly legislated. Bloodline-only I/O, by contrast, assumes that biological descent equals covenant identity without ever producing a verse that defines it that way. The law jurisdiction test, a valid model must explain who is placed under the law's blessings and curses. Covenantal inclusion, I/O observes that Torah repeatedly states there is one law for both, the native and the sojourner, placing both under the same covenantal jurisdiction. Bloodline-only I/O model struggles here because it must explain how someone can be under the law while simultaneously lacking covenant standing, a category Torah never defines. The Pauline logic test, any model must make Paul's arguments coherent. Covenantal inclusion I/O understands under the law redemption, adoption, and inheritance as covenantal jurisdiction categories, which explains why Paul addresses mixed audiences without ethnic qualifiers. Bloodline-only I/O collapses Paul's reasoning into redundancy effectively, making Paul say that Israelites were redeemed because they were Israelites. The counterexample test, a strong model should account for difficult biblical cases without special pleading. Covenantal inclusion, I/O naturally explains figures such as Ruth, Rahab, Caleb the Kenizzite, circumcised foreigners at Passover, Ezekiel's resident foreigners, and proselytes in Acts. Bloodline-only I/O must dismiss these cases, treat them as anomalies, or explain them away. The land versus identity test, Scripture distinguishes land inheritance from covenant identity. Covenantal inclusion, I/O treats land as one covenant benefit among others, not as the definition of Israel itself. Bloodline-only I/O repeatedly treats land inheritance as covenant ontology, even though Torah never equates the two. The historical plausibility test, a model must align with Second Temple historical reality. Covenantal inclusion I/O fits the documented existence of proselytes and covenantally obligated non-native Israelites. Bloodline-only I/O must marginalize or ignore this history in order to preserve a purely biological definition. The category integrity test, Scripture maintains distinctions between election, covenant composition, law, inheritance, and genealogy. Covenantal inclusion I/O preserves these distinctions and lets each category function on its own terms. Bloodline-only I/O collapses these categories into DNA, creating confusion where Scripture makes distinctions. The burden of proof test, the better model relies on explicit textual evidence rather than inference. Covenantal inclusion (IO) rests on direct covenant legislation found in Torah and the prophets. Bloodline-only (IO) depends on assumed biological definitions that are never explicitly stated. The falsifiability test: a credible model must be capable of being disproven. Covenantal inclusion (IO) would be falsified by a verse explicitly defining Israel as biology only while denying covenantal mechanisms of inclusion. No such verse exists. Bloodline-only (IO) offers no clear falsification criteria for its core assumption. The explanatory power test, finally, the strongest model is the one that explains the most data with the fewest assumptions. Covenantal inclusion (IO) coherently explains Torah legislation, prophetic texts, Pauline theology, and historical practice. Bloodline-only (IO) explains selectively and defensively, often relying on boundary enforcement rather than definition. Methodological framing limits the debate space and exposes evasions before they are deployed. That said, Bloodline-only (IO) proponents will likely mount a defense of their own and their objections, which tend to function as methodological evasions, are easily predicted. For example, 1. Redefining falsifiability to exclude covenant evidence. They may argue that covenantal mechanisms like juror law, Passover inclusion, circumcision, oath participation, and cultic access are by definition irrelevant to identity, claiming that only genealogy counts. What's really happening? This is not a rebuttal, it is a preemptive rule change. Bloodline-only (IO) assumes its conclusion by declaring in advance that the very evidence your test is designed to examine doesn't count. Why it fails? A model that excludes entire classes of biblical data from consideration is not falsifiable. It is insulated. If covenant law cannot inform covenant identity, then Torah itself is being sidelined as non-definitional. 2. Equating origin with exhaustive definition. They will likely argue that because Israel originates through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, identity must therefore remain permanently and exclusively biological. What's really happening? This is a genetic fallacy, confusing narrative origin with legal definition. Why it fails? Torah repeatedly distinguishes between the origin of the covenant line, land, inheritance, cultic participation, covenant obligation, and covenant standing. Bloodline-only (IO) collapses these categories into one without textual authorization. This test exposes that collapse. 3. Appealing to Ezra-Nehemiah as a veto. Expect them to treat Ezra-Nehemiah as a trump card: genealogy disputes, foreign wives, holy seed, and separation. What's really happening? They are elevating a post-exilic crisis response into a universal definition of covenant identity. In other words, they are using passages that are descriptive of a certain event, and then arguing that they are prescriptive for the rest of the Bible story. Why it fails? Ezra-Nehemiah addresses administrative legitimacy, priestly purity, and land restoration, not a timeless definition of covenant membership. This test allows those texts to be weighed alongside Torah and prophetic material rather than absolutized. 4. Claiming the tests change the rules. They may accuse you of redefining IO by introducing covenant categories, arguing that bloodline-only IO is the original or pure form. What's really happening? This is tradition-protective cognition. The test threatens identity investment, so the response is to frame scrutiny as betrayal. Why it fails? You are not changing the rules. You are applying the same evidence standards to all definitions, including your own. A model that cannot survive scrutiny without appeal to pedigree is not a scholarly position, it is a sectarian one. 5. Insisting covenant not equal to identity. They will often assert, without explicit textual proof, that covenant governs obligations but never defines who Israel is. What's really happening? This is a modern abstraction imposed on ancient law. Why it fails? In the ancient Near East, and especially in Torah, covenant creates peoplehood. "You shall be my people" is not metaphorical. Deuteronomy 29:10-15 explicitly includes non-native persons standing in the covenant oath. Your test simply takes that seriously. 6. Moving the burden of proof. They may demand a verse that says, "Foreigners become Israelites," while never providing a verse that says, "Israel is exhaustively and immutably biological." What's really happening? This is asymmetric skepticism, demanding explicit proof from one side while relying on assumption for the other. Why it fails? Your test is fair precisely because it asks both models to justify their definitions from the text rather than from inference alone. The core problem for Bloodline-only I.O. is that it's not falsifiable under its own rules. Any evidence that contradicts it is dismissed as exceptional, peripheral, administrative, symbolic, or non-definitional. That is not exegesis, it is boundary maintenance. These tests threaten Bloodline-only I.O. because they insist on something Bloodline-only. I.O. cannot survive, letting the evidence decide rather than protecting the conclusion. When these tests are applied equally, the Bloodline-only I.O. model is not merely challenged, it is exposed as an assumption-driven framework that lacks explicit definition, struggles with Pauline logic, and cannot account for covenantal mechanisms already present in Scripture. Taken together, these tests show that the covenantal-inclusion model of Israel only is not an ad hoc revision, but a more faithful and robust reading of Scripture. It succeeds where Bloodline-only I.O. consistently fails, at the level of definition, coherence, and explanatory scope. The covenantal-inclusion model of I.O. allows covenant to function as covenant, historical, legal, and relational, without collapsing it into biology or land inheritance, categories Scripture itself keeps distinct. By grounding identity in explicit covenant mechanisms rather than inherited assumptions, it accounts for the full range of biblical, Pauline, and historical data with fewer tensions and without special pleading. In contrast, Bloodline-only I.O. depends on inference, resists falsification, and requires rhetorical boundary enforcement to survive. The cumulative weight of the evidence, therefore, favours covenantal inclusion as the stronger, more biblically responsible model. For these reasons, covenantal inclusion emerges not as a revision driven by preference, but as a model capable of definition, testing, falsification, and explanatory coherence, criteria Bloodline-only I.O. consistently fails to meet.